Hello, it's Mike Bird here doing a Word from the Bird video for people who subscribe to my Substack page, doing a long overdue video. I was meant to do a video about egalitarianism and complementarianism, particularly how my views emerged or changed over time. And I haven't done that yet, so I thought I got to do that and also answer some great questions that people had for me. So let me just sketch out where I came from. I did not come from a Christian home. I came from a non-Christian family. Religion just really wasn't on the radar. We weren't particularly for religion or part of it. I'd done a little bit of religious education when I went to primary school, but it would probably my parents, I think particularly my mother, was quite negative about religion. So it was not simply part of my life in any way, apart from the odd sort of thing you see in the wider culture. And I've often said everything about Christianity I learned growing up in Australia, I learned from Ned Flanders on The Simpsons. But when I did become a Christian, when I was about 20, serving in the army, I was then discipled, got into Bible reading, into Bible study. And, I read through the Bible and for a whole bunch of other reasons as well, I naturally gravitated towards a complementarianism as that kind of position. Now, I was in the army, and as I've said, that is a deeply patriarchal, somewhat almost misogynistic environment. At least it was, back then in the early 1990s. I mean, I worked I worked in a place where there was a guy once who had a quote on his desk from Friedrich Nietzsche that said, "Man shall be trained for war, and the woman for the recreation of the warrior. All else is folly." And so in that sort of, context where you're going from adolescence into manhood and doing this at a time in my life where I really just wanted to escape my parents because of their own particular failings and foibles. And so I'm in the army. I come to Christian faith. I'm in a really good church, a new church plant, a lovely Baptist church in Sydney. And so, yeah, I kind of take to a complementarian view. And, and I start reading the Wayne Grudems and the John Pipers. And I never got into Driscoll. I was never really into a sort of a Driscoll thing. But, when I went through seminary from 1999 to 2001, I was kind of, the young, restless reform guy. I was hardcore Calvinist, had my 5 points. I was, a sort of really hardcore Reformed Baptist and believed that the office of elder was exclusively for men. Only men should really do the preaching in church, although you can have women sort of speaking, but only men would do preaching. And around that time, I attended a very conservative church, which had the same sort of view. It wasn't anything I would consider to be a malicious patriarchy, but it was their firm conviction that complementarianism was correct. What changed for me was a number of things. I remember being in a church where I was talking, in the same church, where I was talking to a woman who was planning on leading worship in a Bible study, but one of the pastors kind of stopped her because that would count as leading men and leading people in worship. And I thought, well, that's a little bit heavy-handed. I'm pretty sure that's not what the Apostle Paul was worried about. Some woman with a guitar leading a group in song in like a home Bible study. I don't think that was number one of his concerns, even though I kind of accepted a complementarian reading of 1 Timothy 2 and 1 Corinthians and everything. And then I attended some lectures by Ben Witherington at Morling College in Sydney, I think about 2003, 4 or something like that. I remember Ben gave a very lively lecture on the book of Revelation, but then he also gave some lectures about women in the church, and he went through Romans 16, and he presented a pretty compelling case about women doing all the things I was under the assumption that they couldn't do. And I was sat there and I just wanted to say, yeah, but what about 1 Timothy 2? But what about 1 Timothy 2? But what about 1 Timothy 2? And I realized I had a problem. either I had to change my view of everything in the Bible about women from the Old Testament to the New Testament in order to preserve my interpretation of 1 Timothy 2, or I had to change my interpretation of 1 Timothy 2 to fit what was happening pretty much everywhere else in the Bible, that women were part of the leadership of ancient Israel. There were female prophets, female judges. You've got women called apostles. You've got women involved in the ministry of Jesus. You've got women leaders in the church, like narrated in Romans 16. Women are apostles. Women seem to be church planning in cooperation with their husband. And that's when it just crumbled. And I realized that this thing is not going to fly. But then that kind of left me with the debate with, what do you do, or with the dilemma of what do you do with 1 Timothy 2. So I went back and I read it and I said, okay, some people would read this differently. Some people would say that the author of the Apostle Epistles is not Paul. It's by a post-Pauline generation that is more hierarchical, institutional, and misogynistic, which is a departure from the kind of egalitarian, charismatic Pauline Christianity. And they would just dump the pastoral epistles into that little dumpster called early Catholicism, which is what a bunch of German scholars put everything in the New Testament that they don't like. They just put in the early Catholicism dumpster. Now, I couldn't go that way. I just didn't find it compelling. So with 1 Timothy 2, there was a number of things going on. I think, first of all, I think it's driven by something local. Okay, something local in Ephesus that Paul is writing to Timothy, and we're only hearing one side of that. So, could it be connected to something about the cult of Artemis that had a very prominent view of women? Is it something to do with what Bruce Winter called the new Roman women? You might call them the sort of the Jackie Kennedy women of the mid first century, who are acting in a far more independent and libertine fashion, maybe. Or is it some sort of particular heresy that's taken root in Ephesus? And we know there were a few different. Eventually, in the late first and second century, there were some heresies that kind of emerged. I'm convinced that Paul is dealing with the local circumstance. And one of the things that tips me off about that is when he says women will be saved through childbearing. Does that mean no woman will ever die in childbearing? Well, I don't think that's the case. Is he saying women will not be saved unless they bear children? I don't think that's what he's saying. I think he's echoing something from this sort of aberrant teaching that perhaps has garnered a following or some support by some of the women in the Pauline Ephesian churches. So I think it's something along those lines. And what I think he's really forbidding is women to, not women to teach, but women from domineering through their teaching with a view to promulgating this sort of heretical ideal, which I think is messing with the creation story. All great heresies mess with the creation story. Particularly if you look at the varieties of Gnosticism or Marcionism, there's always a messing with the creation story. Maybe God did not create the world. Maybe the world was created by a demiurge or something like that. Or maybe Adam was a god who fell from grace, or whatever it is. There's always a messing with the creation story in all the great heresies of the Christian tradition. Which meant I thought it was local. What Paul says is prohibition on women teaching, and there is a real prohibition on women teaching. I think it's driven by something local in Ephesus. He doesn't want women to domineer through bad teaching. And then some people also appeal to the creative aspect, that Paul says Adam was born first. Therefore, Adam kind of has a priority as it goes. Now, I found that very compelling initially, but then as someone pointed out to me, Paul uses the same argument in 1 Corinthians 11 about head coverings. I mean, he roots it in nature. And what some people consider natural is actually based on their culture. So it might be a hard pill to swallow, but what some people consider natural can be based on their underlying cultural perspectives. So yeah, Paul does root the head covering thing sort of in creation, or in the sort of Adam and Eve story, but that is clearly a cultural thing. The whole head covering thing is something particular I think, to the Greco-Roman world. I don't think it's a thing in the Jewish world. It's something in the Greco-Roman world. Even if Paul says, though, we have no other teaching in all our churches, it was something that was deeply symbolic of what it meant to be respectable and have a sense of decorum. And this brings us to the tension in I think, Christian ethics. There are some times when Christians are trying to fit in to the Greco-Roman world by saying, hey, look, we're not lawless and we're not lawbreakers. We're not sitting around kind of like having orgies and praying for the assassination of Nero or anything like that. We're not kind of radical misfits messing up the social order. But then there are other times where they clearly did want to be a kind of, if not a threat to the social order, a kind of alternative to it, and maybe be a little bit more subversive in what they were doing. And you could say that tension is between something like the household codes that you get in the New Testament and in Ephesians and Colossians and 1 Peter, where they're trying to show that within a Greco-Roman view of family and ethics and order, that they're respectable, even though I think they modify the sort of standard household codes. They do give it a kind of Christianization, but nonetheless, they're still operating within the ancient household codes. Whereas in other places, you get the idea that they are going against the culture. They are having a genuinely countercultural view of themselves and of the relationship between each other, particularly in the view of equality, greeting one another with a kiss. That was considered a little bit weird. The equality between slaves and masters, at least as it pertains to the realm of Christ. This was the more radical aspect. And that's what I think you've got to wrestle with in early Christianity. There is this sort of both a domestication or even an assimilation to Greco-Roman culture, but there is also a sense in which they do try to buck the trend. And I think you can find within Paul's letters both going on. So that kind of explains to the view I came through. Initially, I thought after I changed, I began thinking, okay, women can participate in the full life of the church. Maybe we should reserve the highest office just for men, because that kind of gels, I think, with the large tradition of the church. And if you want to have ecumenical relationships with Catholics and Greek Orthodox, having women as the leaders might be a problem. I've kind of gone beyond that now. I tend to think that if you're going to have women in the didactic life of the church and women in leadership, you've got to have them on all levels. I think that's the clear logic of what is being presented in the New Testament. I don't think Paul or anyone would say that spiritual gifts come in pink and blue. In other words, I think these gifts are for all men and women in the churches. I actually wrote a little, call it a booklet or a pamphlet, explaining my views on this. It's called Bourgeois Babes, Bossy Wives, and Bobby Haircuts, the case for equality in ministry. I mean, it's only like a couple of dollars. You can get it either on Kindle or from Amazon. In hard copy. That's kind of where I explain sort of, how I changed my mind on sort of egalitarian complementarianism thing. And in the college I teach at Ridley College, we have a variety of views amongst the faculty, and we are able to get along, very respectful of each other. So it's not something where we have to go cannibalistic. It's not something where we have to have complete uniformity on this. We tolerate a number of perspectives. The only thing we ask is you can't use your view to bully or badger other people. Like, men cannot go up to, female women training for ministry and say you shouldn't be here. And, other people can't go up to complementarians and say you're just a bunch of, women hating so-and-sos. So we just treat each other respectfully, and it works. And you can do that. The idea that you cannot live in peace with egalitarians and complementarians. You can have some vigorous debates, but the idea that you can't live at peace with one another, I think, is completely wrong. Although, at least if you're trying to love each other in a Christian way and commit yourself to theological education with all humility and love for others. To answer some of the questions that have been sent to me from Stephen G. He's asking about, how I came to this original position. Was there a piece of scripture that influenced me? Yes, reading Romans 16. And after that, it all kind of fell like a house of cards. Any other influences? I do have to say what had a big influence on me was certainly becoming a father. Because, I view you tend to view your wife as a kind of a helper, and, that's fine in a kind of complementarian world. But then with daughters, you view them not just as like assistants or helpers, but it's kind of like a version of me in feminine form. And, and I know this has happened to many scholars, that, it's having daughters did make them rethink, or a lot more sensitive to the issues of women ministry and their opportunities. Because I think, well, how is my daughter going to be treated in the church? What ministry opportunities will she have? How might God gift her for ministry in the future? So having daughters, I think, was the other thing that had a big impact on me. Christy asks about some insights in 1 Timothy 2:12. I think I've already explained it. I think the prohibition is based on the local context of something that's going on. There's some sort of heresy or false teaching where the women are perhaps imbibing it and then, promulgating this sort of weird alternative view of the creation narrative. And Paul wants to shut it down. He doesn't want them pushing that view in the Ephesian churches. The appeal to the order of creation, Adam was born first. Yeah, that's kind of interesting, but Paul can use those arguments elsewhere, where he's clearly talking about cultural issues, not creational issues. Catherine asks, does complementarianism have effects on abuse in marriage? Well, this is a sensitive one. Men, whether egalitarian or complementarian, can be abusers. Okay, you can be the most egalitarian, pro-women, person, and still be abusive. We know that. What I think studies have shown, and here's I'll defer to the work of Julia Baird and others, is that complementarian men who spasmodically attend church are the worst offenders when it comes to domestic violence committed by allegedly Christian men. Complementarians who are kind of lukewarm in their faith, who are not really regular church attenders, they are the main abusers when it comes to Christian men who commit domestic violence. Like I said, violence done by men against women and children, it defies denominations and theological proclivities. Anyone can do it. The challenge I often give to my complementarian students, I say, okay, you're complementarian. I understand, been there. I understand why you find that attractive. But you've got to make sure, if complementarianism is twistable into a justification for bullying, spiritual abuse, or something like that on women, you've got to ask yourself, what makes it so twistable, and how do you make sure your complementarian cannot be twisted in such a way as it can be used to justify abuse in marriage, or it can be used to justify domineering and belittling behavior. I think that's what you've got to make sure. Gabe asks that, he says, egalitarian doesn't quite feel like the default position. The complementarian view of scripture seems to arise from a plain reading. Well, Gabe, I would dispute that. It depends on which version of complementarianism you're talking about. If you've got a view of complementarianism that says women should not work, the husband works, the women should not work, that, I think, is nothing to do with the Bible at all. In fact, that comes out of a fairly recent phenomena of an affluent consumerist society, where you can have the luxury of only one spouse working. In most places around the world, life is what it is, to the point that, both husband and wife, or mum and dad, both have to work at some level to provide an income and to provide food and shelter for the family. So yeah, in a consumerist affluent society, maybe you can get away with only one spouse working, but that's not how it is in most places in the world. Whether that's running the farm, running the family business, whether you're in China, Africa, South America, stuff like that doesn't work. So it depends which version of complementarianism. And this is where I have to say a lot of complementarianism strikes me as very much a sociological construct built on, Western suburban life in the aftermath of the Second World War. I think there's a lot of it that just comes down to the sociology that looks or tries to find some biblical justifications. And I just don't think it does. And once you realize that what we call complementarianism, particularly with all the weird prohibitions, that people make, like, women shouldn't go to the gym and get too strong or too buff or anything like that. If you look at some of the crazy things people say, what is allegedly a biblical justification for complementarianism, or what it is, you find out this has nothing to do with scripture. And a lot of complementarianism, I think, is driven by culture. Now, let me add, that door swings both ways, and you do have to ask the question, how much of egalitarianism is also indebted to culture? And I mean, I think that is a fair question. There are certain traits in our culture where you could say maybe it's being more driven by different views, different perspectives, certain types of feminism. But that's what I would say. I would say even our feminism is shaped by a broadly Christian ethic, the idea that women should be treated as equals. That's not something that comes out of Aristotle or Plato. That's not something that comes out of Islam. That comes out of a distinctly Christian worldview, I would say. So even our feminism, you might call it a somewhat secular revolution within Christian civilization, but it's something that's based on a Christian ethic. Although there's all different sorts of feminism, they can do some different and crazy things. So yeah, I think Gabe, you've got to remember which type of complementarianism are you talking about, and exactly what are they claiming. But that, in a nutshell, is sort of how I changed my views from being a real hardcore, card-carrying, slightly to the right of John Piper kind of complementarianism, to the wonderful delight of women's affirmation and encouraging all of my dear sisters in Christ in the ministry to which they are called to. That, in a nutshell, is how I came to that position. If you've got any questions on that, throw them below in the comment section, and in the fullness of time, I'll try to get to them. Thanks a lot for listening.